And when you think of a pre-tax account, you can really analyze that to a cookie jar, a glass cookie jar, and all the cookies in the cookie jar are your retirement dollars. You take that glass lid off and you start to bring that cookie in all the way up. That cookie is 100% whole. It's a whole cookie. But then when you go to actually consume that cookie, the government gets to decide first how much of that cookie they're taking. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of Crashes and Taxes. And this is a special edition because I want to discuss with you the assumptions that we make in our country about how our retirement is going to work and why those assumptions are outdated, outmoded, were really established 40 years ago and did not look to where we are today in 2024. So with that, let's get started. I want to dive into this concept, and I think this is perfectly suited for me because as a tax attorney that has tax expertise and knowledge, combined with my financial knowledge and my knowledge of economics, global economics, and markets, it's a really great combination to deal with this exact topic, and I think it's definitely a message for such a time as this. And so for those of you that have ears to hear, I hope that you will share this with your friends, family, give this Crashes and Taxes podcast a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and let us know that this is the kind of content that you're looking for to relate to your friends and family. I know I have diehard Crashes and Taxes believers, but we need this message to go out to all the corners of America to really establish what is happening and why things have changed. And so as you can probably imagine, what I am talking about today, and I'm coming to you from New York, what I'm talking about today is the obsession that America has with deferring their taxes. And I want to specifically go back in time, back into the history. And I really want people to understand how this all happened to bring us to present day in 2024, because we really cannot understand what our assumptions are, what our challenges will be until we understand how we got here and why we got here. So I am, of course, talking about the fact that the majority of Americans have really, since 1981, built the substantial amount, if not all of their wealth, in pre-tax ERISA-governed accounts. ERISA, which is E-R-I-S-A, ERISA stands for the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. And it is the controlling act that controls all of our qualified plan money. When you have a 401k or an IRA or any of its cousins like a 403b, a 457 plan, these are all qualified plans that are managed and governed under the ERISA Act. Now, there are additional deferred compensation plans that are what we call non-qualified. And those, an example of that, a most prominent example of that would be basically a 409A plan, a cash balance plan. These are additional non-qualified deferred compensation plans that basically allow you to sock a lot of money away and not pay the tax until you take distributions. Now, what we want to understand is that the 401k was introduced after ERISA in the Revenue Act of 1978. And at the time it was introduced, it was in the late 70s, as I mentioned, 1978. And we were having a lot of corporate wars going on for top executive talent. So basically what was happening is corporations would give top executives a golden parachute, which would be in the event you leave, you get all these benefits, a pension that would be a lifetime pension, and all kinds of other benefits that they were offering. But they said, you know what, we have so much competition, we need to offer them something else. And so what happened was a benefits consultant at the Johnson Company, not Johnson & Johnson, but the Johnson Company, named Ted Banna, basically in 1981 was tasked with coming up with a savings retirement plan for a bank. And Bannon basically went through and looked at the Revenue Act of 78 and found this 401k provision that was meant, again, for corporate executives, highly compensated corporate executives that would have access to professional money management. And what he saw was, wow, they wrote this into the code that basically says we will give you additional bonuses into a plan, but it won't vest. It will tie the executive, and this is the reason they did it. It would tie the executive to the corporation such that they would have to stay and remain in order to invest into the account and actually get the funds that were being deposited for the retirement. Now, these funds basically were not taxable to them because they weren't paid at the time. And therefore, if they were taxable, it would be what we call phantom income. Of course, no corporation wants to offer somebody a tax bill without an actual benefit. So the IRS agreed that we will defer taxing the money put into this 401k until one, it is distributed, and of course, it has to vest. And so the 401k was birthed. Now, the thing you have to understand is around the same time from the late 70s, early 80s, we had also Congress coming down with legislation that would force corporations to fully fund their pensions and to not raid them for cash flow and other operating purposes, R&D and all these things. So you had two pressures happening in the late 70s and the early 80s, which was defined benefit plans, pension plans, DB plans, were going to become more expensive because the corporation had to fully fund them for the first time under congressional legislation. And you had people not really wanting, and you had this 401k and the Revenue Act of 78, you had people not really wanting to pay taxes, because if you look in 1981, when the 401k really moved into mainstream prominence by corporations, even though it was written in 78, what you saw was our top active income tax rate was 50%, and our top passive income or investment income tax rate was 70%. So you had a high rate of taxation in the 80s, and people were looking for reasons to not pay those taxes. And so Ronald Reagan really took on taxes in his second term, ran on tax reform for his second term, and got tax reform passed in 1986. And what Ronald Reagan did was quite genius. He expanded the brackets and lowered the top bracket to 28%. Now, this top bracket started at close to the equivalent of $30,000, about $28,000. People started getting into that top bracket. So he was really genius and lowering the brackets, but widening them so that a lot more people were sucked into the top bracket of 28%. But it still was one of our lowest tax rates, our second lowest tax policy scheme, really, since FDR in 1933. So in 1933, under FDR, we had our top bracket at 25%. And then again, under Reagan, he reduced it under the 86 tax law changes to 28%. Under the Trump tax plan, it was reduced from where it was at 39% down to 37%. So even though it is higher than FDR's 25% and Ronald Reagan's 28% top brackets, it is still relatively low in the history of time, and certainly lower than the 50% that it was in the 1980s. So what you had was people successfully leveraged the 401k and moved to the 401k in droves. They weren't really thinking about the fact they were losing a pension and that corporations were going to move away from a pension. They were more thinking about, my tax rate is really high. I'm in my peak earning years. I don't want to pay these taxes in my peak earning years. So let me defer the taxes until I retire, because when I retire, I will make less. So the conventional financial wisdom that Americans have lived under really now since 1981 is that while you're in your high earning years and you're making the most money you'll make, and therefore you're in your highest tax bracket, don't actually pay the taxes on every dollar of your income. Defer taxes and the payment of taxes by wealth building into this 401k or into this IRA. And then when you retire, because you'll be making less in retirement, you'll be in a lower tax bracket. And when you have a progressive tax that goes up as you make more, that logic makes sense. And so for the last 40 years, since 1981, over 40 years now, we've really had a lot of people successfully, millions of Americans, have dollar cost averaged into the equity markets through the employer use of the 401k, and they have retired, and their retirement income has been less. And because we still are in a decent tax scheme right now under the Trump Tax and Jobs Cuts Act of 2017, it really has worked for them. So my practice puts out a lot of information, and we're constantly talking to people about the need to really assess their assumptions about what is going to happen in their retirement, and really to decide, if having the federal government as your silent partner in your investment accounts for the rest of your life makes sense. It did make sense in the 80s at where we were in the 80s. But what we need to do now is start to challenge financial and conventional wisdom and decide, does this still hold true in 2024? And so, as employers moved away from defined benefit and moved to the 401k, you did see a lot less of the actual employer's money going towards retirement. And we see with the defined contribution plans that the risk and the onus is completely on the employee, which was not how it used to be. And a lot of employees rightfully complain. But what you had was instead of finding a pension for someone for their lifetime and having all that responsibility and having to fund it fully based on congressional changes in the 80s, what you now see is corporations, usually typically the most common scenario is that they will fully match 100% dollar for dollar everything an employee contributes to a 401k up to 3% of their salary. And then usually we see a diminution of the match on the next 3%. So then they will match 50% on average of the next 2% of salary. So what you're getting is basically a full 100% match on the first 3% of your salary, and then a 50% match on the second 3% for a total of 6% that can be contributed of an employee's salary that would be some kind of match. And so you can see that corporations wanted to move to this in droves because literally corporations were not having to put nearly as much income in or as much bandwidth into to keep the employee's contribution of their retirement intact. So you can see that by default, we definitely went to the 401k, but because of how it came about, because it was intended to be an additional layer for highly compensated executives when it was written into the code 1978, it was never designed, tested, mathematically, quantitative regression analysis was not performed on whether it would be a good main retirement vehicle of the United States. And since we had none of that testing because it happened by accident, we didn't get a lot of the hard questions answered as, will this work in all scenarios and forever? And that is really the problem that we are coming into now, that we are seeing with this aged 40-year, over 4-decade program. What is happening now with this? And does it make sense for us to continue to believe that once we retire, simply because we're making less money, that we will pay lower taxes? And I have to stop and say here that the conventional wisdom was born. Don't pay all your tax now in your highest earning years. Defer, and when you retire, because you'll be making less, you'll be in a lower bracket, and then you'll pay less. That conventional wisdom is what we need to substantially challenge and to analyze and to figure out, does this still hold true today in 2024? And I have to say that a lot of people, that conventional wisdom really requires that your income go down in retirement. And I want to carve out a little niche for our clients of Walser Wealth, because most of our clients don't expect their income to go down. If we've had enough time to do the proper planning and to really build the asset base, we're looking to give our clients the same amount of cash flow that they lived on for the majority of their adult life, or even more. Because the truth is that most Americans that do have financial resources will actually spend more money in what we call their go years. So in the first couple of years of retirement, when you're still active and super healthy and super excited to be retired and living your life, you might take up an expensive hobby like golfing 3 times a week, or you might take up European cruises, or a lot more travel, or a second home where you can live bi-coastally, just another property, or you want to do a VRBO and live there part of the year and rent it out of the other part of the year. So during your go years, most Americans with financial means do actually spend more in retirement in the first couple of years. And then we see that taper off and slow down. We call that the slow go years. And then obviously, as we get closer and closer to our final end of our self on this life, we call that the no-go years. And that's where you're a lot more sedentary and maybe you are then spending less. But for the most part, if you have enough time to really plan and properly prepare for your financial retirement, then we would expect that your actual income should stay the same or even go up for you while you're spending more, and then taper off and slow down over time. I want to acknowledge and I want to validate, because we put a lot of materials out there on an educational basis from the practice Walser Wealth, and we constantly get feedback when we talk about this 401k, because so many people have really and truly, with IRAs, built their financial well-being in these ERISA governed qualified plans. And we get a lot of pushback saying, oh, we're back up. The 401k worked perfect for me and everything's been fine. And I want to validate and acknowledge that and say, you're right. It has worked for the last 40 years for people that built their income while they were working years and they were making more and now they're retired making less. It did allow them to dollar cost average in, and it does allow them currently right now to pay less taxes on those dollars as they take them as distributions. But we aren't talking about how it's worked the last 40 years. We're talking about the divergence of the last 40 years that is beginning now. And we're talking about challenging our assumptions that what we believe to be true, because it's been true for the last 40 years, will continue to be true for the next 40 years. So we're really challenging, as our practices model is, we're challenging the wisdom of financial convention and asking you to ask yourself, does this still make sense in 2024? And so what we can see is that, first of all, we know that the Trump tax plan from 2017 is going to sunset at the end of 2025. It was passed in the budget reconciliation process, which means it couldn't affect the budget for more than a 10-year period. Therefore, it does sunset at the end of 2025, where our tax policy as of January 1 of 2026 will revert back to what it was prior to 2017. And so the thing I want you to understand is when conventional wisdom was born that said, don't pay the taxes now, pay them when you're retired, you're in a lower bracket, that mathematical equation has an assumption in it. And that is the assumption that the only thing that matters in that equation is how much I'm making. But it completely disregards the fact that tax rates can, and in fact, mathematically must change. So what I want to go into with you is exactly why these things are now changing in 2024. So let's get into our slides here. Let's start with our first slide. You can see this is from the Mises Institute, which is an Austrian economist, basically von Ludwig Mises, that came up with the crack up boom. And I would refer you to the podcast I did in April about the crack up boom, because I do see some validity to this economic theory right now in 2024. But you can see that this is an article that states that the US is entering a debt spiral. And that is because a function of the fact that we have close to almost $35 trillion of publicly acknowledged debt. And when you have that much, in fact, our deficit is increasing by $1 trillion every 100 days. The Biden administration just put out in the last 2 months a 2025 fiscal budget of $7.3 trillion. Now, this is in the absence of a direct war. You could assert that we're in a proxy war with Russia via Ukraine, but we are not in a direct war. We are not in the middle of a global pandemic. And so the fact that our U.S. budget federally has now ballooned to over $7 trillion in and of itself is a massive problem. And the real issue is that the discretionary spending of that $7 trillion is really only $2 trillion. And fixed costs are about $5 trillion. And this is, in fact, the biggest problem that we have. And we're going to get into that, and we're going to go through that. When you look at the fact that we have a $7 trillion budget outside of war and outside of pandemic, when there's a shutdown of the economy, you start to see that the central banks of the world are beginning to really question, and have been probably for the last 4 years or 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, they're really beginning to question the ability of America to remain the global reserve currency. And I'm talking specifically about the US dollar. And now when you look at what has happened since Russia did invade Ukraine in February of 2022, and the West kicked Russia out of the SWIFT international payment processing system, you saw Russia de-dollarize immediately, exponentially. Like some 80+%, 82%, I believe, of their transactions were dollar denominated prior to 2022. And as of last year, you had about 13% of their transactions dollar denominated. So you have the Russia bloc moving completely away from the dollar as per they have to. but which is then really creating this BRICS bloc, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and about 70 other countries, that the GDP of the BRICS bloc now is and exceeds the GDP of the G7. The G7 being the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. So that block of 7 countries basically has a GDP that is now exceeded by the BRICS bloc. So as countries are moving and realigning to the east, we start to believe that if we don't get our fiscal house in order in the United States, we are in severe jeopardy of losing our dollar reserve status. And this is what this article is talking about, is that we are in a debt spiral. We continue to spend 7 trillion plus, even though our tax revenue is not anywhere near that, which means we keep adding to our debt on an annual basis to the tune of 1 to 2 trillion. And that is just too fast. And our interest costs for the first time in 2024 are actually going to outpace our spending on the Department of Defense. All of our military spending, all of our military budget is now eclipsed with actual interest. So it used to be that Social Security was our largest expense, and then the Department of Defense, and then Medicare and interest. Now interest has moved into the second highest expense after Social Security. So this is unsustainable. And this is why you have this US entering a debt spiral problem. Then we have here the Federal Reserve's debt to GDP from Q4. And you can see here that in Q4, the Federal Reserve reported that the debt to GDP was 121%. But if we look at the full 2023 number, we see that our GDP was 27.36 trillion. You can see that right here, 27.36 trillion. And when you divide your publicly acknowledged debt of nearly 35 trillion by the GDP of 2023, you get now a debt to a GDP ratio that is unsustainable of about 127%. This is why you now see articles talking about the debt spiral of the US and how we are now in an unsustainable path that we must fiscally get under control. You can see here that the debt clock, usdebtclock.org, is reporting that we're just under $35 trillion of debt. And so now I want to share my screen with you, and I want to show you a few other things that absolutely have happened. Just want to share the entire screen here. And I want you to see this article. This is a study from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. You can see what it says that I've highlighted. This is the Congressional Budget Office talking about the impact of the retirement of the baby boomers, because this was in 2008. This was before coronavirus. This was before massive debt explosion, although we did have a large deficit in debt back then. But you can see that they say the tax rate for the lowest tax bracket would have to be increased from 10% to 25%. The tax rate on incomes in the current 25% tax bracket, which would be the middle class, would have to be increased to 63%. And the tax rate in the highest bracket would have to be raised from 35% to 88%. I also want to share with you this Bloomberg article from last year, where you can see that retirees face $17,400 cut to Social Security benefits in as fast as 2033. So let's go back and understand, why is all of this happening? What has happened that has made us in such a dire financial place? And why is no one talking about it? Why is the mainstream not telling people this? Why do people not understand that the United States really is on the cusp of such financial demise of the reserve status? You have China that has in the last several years de-dollarized or gotten rid of the dollars that they were holding by 40%. You have a situation right now with Japan where the yen is trading at the lowest it has to the dollar. It's about 157 to 1 yen to dollars. And that is completely unsustainable for Japan. We're worried about them potentially dumping dollars because they have to stabilize their currency. So we have a lot, and Japan is the single largest holder of US debt outside of the United States themselves. So when you realize that we are still in the third lowest tax bracket and tax regime since FDR, again in the 1933s, 25%, Reagan and 1986 at 28%, and when Trump 2017, 37%. We really are in the third lowest tax scheme that we've had since the income tax came into being in 1913. So when we look at the fact that this conventional wisdom of don't pay your taxes now, but wait till you retire, you're in a lower bracket, we start to glaringly realize that conventional wisdom really requires and only takes into consideration what your income is. It does not take into consideration that the tax rates themselves might go up, and they might go up dramatically as the CBO has forecasted. So our practice is really about control. Our clients want to control the wealth that they have that they're going to live on. And when you think of a pre-tax account, you can really analyze that to a cookie jar, a glass cookie jar, and all the cookies in the cookie jar are your retirement dollars. You take that glass lid off and you start to bring that cookie in all the way up. That cookie is 100% whole. It's a whole cookie. But then when you go to actually consume that cookie, the government gets to decide first how much of that cookie they're taking. And everybody assumes when they come to talk to us, the last 10 years, I can't tell you how many people have come into our practice and they basically have said, I asked them, how much cash flow do you need to live on? And if someone wants $100,000, they might say to me, I need $100,000. I'm going to get between my spouse and myself, we're going to get 40 in Social Security. So that leaves me with 60, but all 60 is taxable. So I need to apply a 25% tax rate. So I probably need about, I don't know, Rebecca, I probably need about 80 a year to get to 60 so they'll tell me I need $80,000 a year because in their mind, they've already applied to 25% bracket. So I have to actually ask people, do not give me your after-tax number after you've applied a 25% tax. I want you to let me compute and back into your tax policy rate as you retire. So tell me what your free cash flow needs to be, and then I will compute how much of an actual cookie it's going to take to deliver that to you, because I'm fully aware that the government is absolutely believes that they are going to increase the taxes substantially in order to continue this massive level of spending. So we don't accept that we're going to put our clients into a situation in retirement where the government is going to have the largest tax need in the history of our country by a factor of about 10. We don't accept that those clients should be in a position of having all of their dollars in pre-tax because it is not sustainable and is not controllable. And we know that the government has to raise taxes, and they have to raise taxes exponentially. And that is why the CBO analysis really said that taxes must go up. Now, what is the reason? Yes, we've had coronavirus. Yes, we've had a lot of wars, all kinds of wars that we've been funding for the last 40 years, long-term wars too, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and then Ukraine. But now what we're looking at is what is causing, there is a singular event that is causing these tax rates to really have to massively go up. And what is it? And it turns out that it is the retirement of our first full generation, our baby boomers, which were born between 1946 and 1964. Social Security was signed into law in 1935, and Medicare was signed into law in 1965. So the baby boomers are our first full generation that fully worked their very first job while Social Security was already a law. And they have not fully retired. We have about 40% of our boomers retired as of right now. And we expect that number will go from 40% to 98% by 2028. So this retirement of our full generation for the first time ever, it's never happened before in the history of our country, onto our social safety nets of Social Security and Medicare is in fact what is going to need us to raise taxes astronomically. Now, some economists say that the trust fund is going to last through 2033, which is the reason you see the federal government projecting that benefits will be cut after that. But I need you to understand that there's really no dollars in the trust fund. The $3 trillion that has been collected since 1935 in Social Security payroll taxes has not been paid out in Social Security benefits, has in fact been borrowed by the federal government for other projects, infrastructure projects, roads, military, whatever they've needed to use it. There was a Supreme Court case when all the Supreme Court said that's fine. They just have to account for Social Security separately. So the federal government has rated that $3 trillion Social Security Trust Fund, and they put in place something called special treasury notes, STNs, that basically say, when the payroll taxes for Social Security are not enough to cover the current benefits, the federal government guarantees the difference. And the federal government is not a creator of anything. They simply print money or raise taxes. And so this is the singular event, the full retirement of the baby boomers, that will, in fact, upset our apple cart so much that we will have to have substantial tax policy increases. And so this is just math. Math is math. And so for those of you that say, Rebecca, there's no president and there's no Congress that have the political aptitude to raise taxes and therefore it will never happen, I need you to understand that our economy and our reserve currency will collapse, as every other reserve currency globally has collapsed at some point, leading way to the new currency. And what we're seeing is that this is happening as the world is de-dollarizing and moving closer to the Chinese yuan and the BRICS bloc. And for those of you that say, oh, it's not feasible, no one will vote for it, it isn't about that. It's about the fact that the global world is losing confidence in the US dollar and the US Congress and government's ability to maintain fiscal discipline, and they are moving away from the dollar. So we don't have to have the Congress and the US federal government accept that they need to raise taxes. The world will tell us that they are done with our dollars before that. And so for those of you that say, besides government officials not wanting to do it, that it will never happen, the taxes will never be able to be for the middle class in the 60s, I would really point you to all of Europe that has middle class tax rates in the 50s and up when they provide socialized medicine and university funding and all those things for free for their entire population. But I also want to just tell you that math is math. And if you are driving northbound on the highway and see a car approaching you, the southbound lane, for people that say, Rebecca, you don't know that taxes are going to go up, I say to you, you don't know that the car in the southbound lane is going to hit you head on. But as you see the danger approaching clearly, every fiber of your being innately is telling you to change lanes and avert the danger. And that is exactly where we are in the United States of America. We see that tax rates cannot remain as historically low as they are, that they must go up simply with the retirement of the baby boomers, not even combining that with all of the federal debt that we've accumulated because of military conflict and all of the other things that are going on in the world, pandemics and what have you. So we are at a time where it is time and it is necessary to understand that conventional financial wisdom of building pre-tax wealth to retire into a lower bracket because you make less is over. The government has to get the tax dollars from the people that have the tax revenue, the assets, and that is our clients and that is you. And so you need to challenge yourself to say, this is not going to work out as it has for the last 40 years. It is going to change, and this is why. And I encourage you to, even if you say, gosh, I've built millions of dollars, Rebecca, in pre-tax, how am I going to convert it? That is something we specialize in, delivering control, and obviously it needs to be done in a very methodically phased in system. But we also have to balance the methodically phased in system and plan with the fact that we are running out of low tax years because baby boomers are retiring in earnest very fast now. It is upon us. It is the time to stop thinking the old way, to realize what's happening, and just shift lanes, shift course, and take more control of our retirement dollars. And so I challenge you today to really consider this message, what we're thinking, what we believe to be coming, and ask yourself, are you on the right track? Are you prepared for taxes to go up astronomically based on how you structured your tax classification of your assets? And with that, I thank you for listening to me and finding out all this information about how America is changing and changing. Care everybody until next time. Hey.